Continuing from our previous discussion on the self-limitations of German idealism's thought, we now turn our attention to how this philosophical landscape gave rise to a distinct movement, Romanticism. This isn't just about dusty old books, it's about a fundamental shift in how thinkers grappled with reality, politics, and the very idea of meaning. So where did this romantic movement spring from? Well, it's deeply intertwined with German idealism. Think of them as cousins, sharing a lot of DNA. Both these movements really disliked the Enlightenment's tendency to break everything down into tiny, isolated parts, what they called mechanism and atomism. Instead, they championed ideas like organism, individuality, and imagination. It's like moving from a clockwork universe to a living, breathing one. Interestingly, while they were both critical of the Enlightenment, they didn't throw out all its baby with the bathwater. They still believed in key things like reason and progress, even as they sought a more holistic, less fragmented way of understanding the world. It's a fascinating tension right there. But things started to change around the turn of the century. The collaborative energy of the early days, like the famous Athenaeum journal run by Novalis and the Schlegel brothers, began to fade. This marks a clear break, ushering in what we call late Romanticism. Think of it as the movement maturing, perhaps getting a bit older and wiser, or maybe just more focused. Philosophers like Fichte and Schelling were still wrestling with big philosophical questions. The main players in this later phase shifted their gaze. Philosophy wasn't abandoned, but it took a back seat. What came to the forefront? A deep dive into history, especially Christian and German culture, musings on nature, artistic projects, and crucially, a new way of thinking about the state and politics. The focus narrowed, becoming more historically and culturally grounded. Now, what lit this fire under the Romantics? The French Revolution. It wasn't just some distant political event, it was a seismic shockwave that hit philosophy, literature, and politics all at once. For the Romantics, it was like finding a treasure map. They saw it as proof that something profound was happening. A revolution not just in France, but in human consciousness itself, a step towards greater freedom. Friedrich Schlegel, for instance, put the French Revolution right up there with Fichte's philosophy and Goethe's novel as the defining influences of his entire era. He saw them as world historical revolutions. Imagine being part of that Jena circle, feeling like you were witnessing the birth of a new kind of unity, where reason, imagination, and political action weren't separate things, but were weaving together into something tangible, something like a concrete utopia. That's the intoxicating feeling they were chasing. Initially, the Romantics looked at the French Revolution through rose-tinted glasses. They saw it as the ultimate sign of progress, a giant leap forward in humanity's understanding of freedom. They framed history as moving from smaller localized achievements like ancient Greece or medieval Europe towards a grand cosmopolitan era. Thinkers like Rousseau and the French revolutionaries were seen as ushering in this new age, characterized by universal human rights. But as we know, reality has a way of complicating things. As events unfolded in France later on, disillusionment crept in. The initial revolutionary fervor cooled down. For the Romantics, the political edge dulled, but the mythological interpretation stuck. The dream of revolution faded, replaced by another cultural mythology, one heavily influenced by the political restoration that followed. Suddenly, the language shifted again, borrowing terms from the old powers, church and monarchy, showing a significant retreat from the earlier radicalism. Before diving deeper into the Romantics' own ideas, let's quickly acknowledge some giants whose shoulders they stood on. First up, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was absolutely pivotal. Think of him as the source code for many of the Romantics' critiques of the Enlightenment. His ideas about nature, emotion, authenticity, and the dangers of civilization resonated deeply. You can see his fingerprints all over the work of thinkers like Herder, Hölderlin, Novalis, Friedrich Schlegel, and even the German idealists. Rousseau wasn't just a philosopher, he was a political force, embodying that potent mix of revolutionary politics and philosophy. However, as the Romantics' own revolutionary zeal began to cool, so too did their reliance on Rousseau. His influence naturally diminished as their focus shifted. Next, Immanuel Kant. Now, even though the Romantics often criticized the Enlightenment, they couldn't ignore Kant, especially when it came to ethics and aesthetics. In these areas, Kant was seen as the rightful successor to Rousseau. His unwavering commitment to autonomy, the idea that we are ultimately responsible for our own moral decisions, really struck a chord with the younger generation. They were impressed by his rigorous take on moral consciousness, and they adopted a key term from him, productive imagination. This wasn't just about pretty pictures. It was a core concept fundamental to how they built their philosophical systems. It's like Kant gave them a powerful tool, and they ran with it. Then there's Johann Gottfried Herder. He was a fascinating figure, bridging the gap between the Enlightenment and its critics. Influenced by both Rousseau and Kant, he tried to synthesize their ideas in a way that proved very influential for the Germans. While he had strong humanistic values, he was actually quite cautious about the revolutionary fervor sweeping through early idealism and romanticism. He believed in cultural uniqueness and national spirit. Herder wrote extensively on mythology. His earlier work, on the modern use of mythology, was about bringing Nordic myths back into the spotlight, setting them apart from Greek and Roman ones. But his later work, Iduna, or the Apple of Rejuvenation, is particularly important for our story. It shows how mythology isn't just old stories, but something actively shaping culture. For Herder, it was all about the power of poetic imagination in creating and forming human experience, what he called Bildung, or cultivation. And finally, Friedrich Schiller. His famous work on the aesthetic education of humanity is a cornerstone for understanding Romantic political thought. Schiller diagnosed modern society as fundamentally unbalanced, leading to two bad outcomes. On one hand, you get savages where raw feelings dominate, art is despised, and nature rules absolutely. On the other hand, you get barbarians, where rigid principles crush feelings, nature is dishonored, and people become slaves to abstract rules. Neither is good. Schiller's solution? A balanced approach through moral and aesthetic education. The goal is to make nature a friend, not a master, and to control only its arbitrary aspects. This transformation allows society to move from a state of mere need, a notestat, towards a true state of freedom. This echoes the debates between Hobbes and Rousseau about social contracts. Following Rousseau, Schiller envisioned a new kind of community that could overcome this state of egoistic struggle. By the 1990s, the intellectual currents flowing from Rousseau, Kant, Herder, Schiller, and Fichte were being channeled into distinct systems by younger philosophers and writers. A major focal point during this period was the discussion surrounding Kant's On Perpetual Peace. This wasn't just an academic exercise, it was a critical juncture. These treatises on perpetual peace acted as a mirror, reflecting the Romantics' changing attitudes. They document a clear transition away from the earlier revolutionary zeal in politics, philosophy, and literature, towards a more cautious stance, especially regarding the French Revolution. This cooling-off period essentially paved the way for the emergence of late Romanticism. So how did different thinkers respond to Kant's plan for peace? There was a spectrum of reactions. Some, like Fichte, Friedrich Schlegel, and Gurres, actually modified and even radicalized Kant's ideas, still holding on to a positive view of the French Revolution. Others, like the elder Herder, took a more moderate line. But then you had figures like Novalis and Friedrich Gentz, who clearly broke away from the revolutionary programs of early Romanticism and Idealism. Let's recap Kant's proposal. He advocated for universal civil rights based on republican constitutions, extended to a League of Free States. He saw this as the ideal political setup for realizing morality. He acknowledged the tricky relationship between ethics and politics, the serpent versus dove dilemma, arguing for legal constraints on selfishness, always keeping ethics above politics. Philosophy's role? To guard moral principles, offer indispensable advice, but not claim expert status in practical decisions. Despite these careful distinctions, Kant's work sparked massive debate, intertwining with the ongoing discussion of the French Revolution and ultimately signaling the shift towards late Romanticism. Friedrich Schlegel, in his 1796 review, responded positively to Kant but with his own spin. He focused heavily on the ethical and political interpretation of the French Revolution. Remember his earlier work, Correction of Public Judgment? He argued that judging the revolution solely by history was insufficient. Social justice had to be considered. He pushed Kant's Republican idea further towards radical autonomy. Every man is naturally free. But he also pointed out that the necessary conditions for such an ideal republic, both nationally and internationally, simply weren't met yet. Political oppression and social injustice were rampant. Therefore, just appealing to moral law wasn't enough, because the law was only formal, telling everyone to restrict freedom but not material, specifying how much restriction. Despite this, Fichte remained optimistic about human progress, pointing to the revolutions in France and America as evidence. Now, contrast Fichte's reception with Friedrich Schlegel's essay on the same topic, published in the same year. Schlegel was much more critical of liberalism. For him, the state wasn't just a means, it was the primary end of human community. He warned against isolating the individual mechanically. He rejected the idea that a republic's value is just about its size extensive quantum. It needed an intensive quantum, a real sense of shared community, liberty, and equality. Morality, he insisted, was essential for any perfect state, making Kant's attempt to separate ethics and politics seem like political trickery to him. Schlegel emphasized the importance of political education. Perpetual peace, he argued, is just empty words without being rooted in political history and educational principles. His essay already signals a move away from Kant's liberalism and the broader revolutionary fervor of the early period. Joseph Goeritz also weighed in with his essay Universal Peace, an Ideal in 1795. Like others, he framed the French Revolution as a landmark moment in the history of human rights, adopting a philosophy of history perspective. This naturally led to a cosmopolitan outlook. He felt humanity had progressed so far that achieving true cosmopolitanism shouldn't be too hard. He also criticized mechanistic views of the state, but interestingly, his critique extended beyond the individual community to the community of nations. He argued the Jacobins fought for human rights universally, not just for France. However, Goeritz didn't stay a committed supporter of the revolution. As Napoleon rose to power, he distanced himself, becoming a classic example of the shift from the early, more optimistic Romanticism to the later, more conservative phase. Okay, let's get to the heart of early Romanticism, the new mythology. This was their big project, to create a mythology for the modern age, just like ancient cultures had theirs. But what did they mean by mythology? It wasn't just about old gods and heroes. It was about transcending the limitations of purely rational, discursive knowledge. It was about using mythological reconstruction to understand the past and shape the future. They weren't afraid to borrow from antiquity, as seen in Hölderlin and Schlegel. This idea evolved, finding a powerful expression in Novalis's Christianity or Europe, which marks the beginning of the shift towards late Romanticism. The oldest systematic program famously declared poetry as the teacher of mankind, and a mythology of reason as the new religion. Other key works include Friedrich Schlegel's Discourse on Mythology and Schelling's plans for a mythological view of nature. What fueled this ambitious new mythology? Primarily, it was a fusion of the ideas sparked by the French Revolution and the conceptual tools provided by classical German philosophy. Even Hegel, much later in life and long after his own disillusionment, looked back at this connection with awe, calling it a wonderful sunrise and a sublime movement. He saw the revolution and idealist philosophy as two sides of the same coin, representing a reconciliation between the divine and the world. For Hegel, the French and German peoples had jointly created this great epoch. The most striking embodiment of this synthesis is found in the anonymous systematic program, widely believed to involve Hölderlin, Schelling, and Hegel. Let's peek inside the systematic program. It starts with a blend of Spinoza's monism and idealism, rejecting any idea of a God-given order from outside. It proposes a complete system where theory and practice are unified. The world itself is seen as created by a free, self-conscious moral being, a true creation out of nothing. This means all metaphysics bows to ethics. Morality doesn't need a reward from heaven, it's justified in itself. And this moral world isn't separate from nature, rather, nature itself makes a moral world possible. But here's the kicker. Such a nature can't be understood by cold mechanical science. It requires a speculative physics, one that incorporates concepts like purpose, teleology, and living organisms, organism. This focus on organism and teleology shapes their critique of existing states and societies. They saw current models as controlling people like machines, which is bad. The vision: a community where each person's freedom is a building block, contributing to the whole. They drew inspiration from Shaftesbury and Rousseau, seeing the state as an organism where individual freedoms merge into collective freedom. From this organic view, perpetual peace becomes a natural outcome, like a constitution or government. Beauty unites truth and benevolence, making aesthetic judgment the highest form of reason. This binds philosophy to poetry. The goal is a cultural utopia built on this new mythology, a mythology of reason that blends the monotheism of reason with the polytheism of imagination. Echoing Rousseau and Herder, they hoped for overcoming social divisions, started by the Enlightenment. The punchline: both sides need to shake hands. Mythology must become philosophical to make people rational, and philosophy must become mythological to make philosophers sensuous. Friedrich Schlegel's discourse on mythology picks up these themes. While aligning with the general goals of the new mythology, his phrasing sometimes seems to echo the systematic program. But he adds his own flavor. His concept of universal poetry isn't just about art, it's about poeticizing life and society itself, working from the deepest levels of the human spirit using symbolic language. He borrowed the idea of Lebensform, or life form, from Herder, suggesting that a culture's unique life form is expressed in its language. The new mythology, therefore, must emerge from the deepest spiritual depths and be the most artistic creation ever. Its purpose? To counteract the fragmentation of the modern world, even within poetry. Crucially, Schlegel sees this as future-oriented, not about repeating old myths. It's about regaining a center of life located in the future. Ancient mythologies can help indirectly, but the new mythology is about a new era. He acknowledges idealism's role alongside political revolutions. Like the program, he includes nature, emphasizing speculative physics. He views Schelling's influence on physics positively, but calls for a mythological view of nature as the next big step. His epistemology and ontology draw on Spinoza, aiming for a monistic integration independent of the subject, allowing humans to grasp the infinite. The objectivity of this new mythology comes from human culture itself, reflecting human nature. Mythology is such an artwork of nature. Novalis brought a new term to the table, romanticizing. This wasn't just about writing love stories. For Novalis, romanticizing is the process of finding the original sense of things. It's a qualitative involution, where the lower self connects with a higher self. We are in essence a series of powers. When you give everyday things a deeper meaning, make the ordinary seem mysterious, or the known seem dignified like the unknown, or the finite feel like the infinite, you're romanticizing. Conversely, the higher mystical elements become commonplace through this connection. It's a reciprocal elevation and debasement. This idea stems from Kant and Fichte, highlighting the power of imagination. It's not just about beauty. Imagination is fundamental to language, knowledge, and culture. It's constitutive, actively constructing and reconstructing our understanding of the world. Art plays a huge role in this new mythology. It's not just about copying nature. The object of art is something organic, organized by symbols and imbued with soul. Schelling gives a scathing example of failed art, poorly made statues in the desert, destined to cost their creators' souls. True art, he says, is like repeating the first symbolism of God in nature. Art objects have a timeless reality, like plants or people. The symbolism in mythology comes from nature and returns to it. Mythological creations are only possible in relation to nature. Like the program, this approach holds high hopes for transforming society. The goal is a higher state of culture, where individuals and humanity merge again. Schelling laments the decline of public life into private dullness and calls for a nation acting like a living organism or person. The nation provides the political unity needed for genuine public life, and the objectivity of science, art, and religion depends on this. However, Schelling's increasing focus on being itself signals a move towards late Romanticism, where the foundation shifts from imagination to something more metaphysical. So, what are the basic outlines of this new mythology? At its core, it's about shared representations within a community, expressed through language, religion, art, and politics. It's the lived reality of a culture, giving meaning and value to human existence. This idea has proven remarkably resilient, influencing modern thought, including the Frankfurt School's critique of instrumental reason and Adorno's emphasis on art's role. However, a key limitation of the early Romantic and Idealist project is that it leaves unclear how exactly to regain new center of life once old traditions are dismantled. The era when art, especially poetry, was seen as humanity's teacher largely ended by the late 18th century. What followed was an era dominated by neoconservative visions. The early new mythology aimed to elevate reason, but late Romanticism often turned against reason, embracing irrationality. Ethically, there was also a shift from a universal, internal spiritual world to particularistic concepts centered on people or nations. Even when Romantics focused purely on philosophy or aesthetics, their ideas inevitably had political undertones. The link between philosophical and political Romanticism wasn't fixed. Changes in one area rippled through the other. The French Revolution was a major catalyst. Novalis's Faith and Love, published in 1798, marks a significant shift. He explicitly champions monarchy as the ideal state, represented by a royal couple. Similarly, Christianity or Europe is largely an apology for Christian culture and its potential role in global peace. Schelling, reacting to this turn, expressed sharp criticism in his Heinz Wiederpost. The neoconservatism of late Romanticism, championed by figures like Friedrich Schlegel, Joseph Goeritz, Franz von Baader, and Adam Müller, drew partly from earlier Romantic ideas but developed its own distinct political stance. A key retained idea was the unity of individual and community, rooted in the systematic program and emphasized by Novalis. The belief that man cannot exist outside community remained central. To become and remain human, man needs the state. The state itself was seen as a person, with its own character and self-governing nature. However, late Romanticism defined this person-community relationship differently than the early phase. It rejected the cosmopolitanism of the young Jacobins, focusing instead on the specific character of a cultural community. The relationship became less symmetrical and more derivative, with the member serving the whole, echoing Rousseau's idea of the organism. There was a clear tendency to downplay aesthetic individualism and cosmopolitanism, emphasizing instead the functions of a cultural community. Yet, it's more complex than simple reactionariness. The community late Romanticism envisioned wasn't just something that existed or had existed, it was something still needing to be created. Novalis saw poetry's role as analogous to religion, transcending discursive knowledge. He demanded art determine personal and cultural life, aiming to create a new unity. This attempt introduced a neo-conservative element. He criticized the politics of his time as half-state, half-nature, envisioning a perfect, visible poetic state, a macroanthropos, realized through monarchy in faith and love. Still, he wasn't uncritical of all states, attacking Frederick the Great's Prussian machinery. He saw the French Revolution as temporary, justifying the end of feudalism, unlike Burke. His interest in monarchy was tied to the royal couple as moral models. He envisioned a poetic history of Europe, centered on an idealized Christian Middle Ages, arguing the Enlightenment failed emotionally and religiously. He looked forward to a future Christianity, not a return to Catholicism, with a visible church transcending nations. He transformed the secular new mythology into a concrete cultural ideal, picturing New Jerusalem as the world capital. After 1800, the initial ethical and cultural enthusiasm of the early Romantics and idealists cooled. It was replaced by a program focused on moral and religious education. Friedrich Schlegel's lectures from the early 1800s supported state-implemented education in public morality, arguing politics should perform educational tasks for cultural reasons, with the church as a model. In his later work, The Signature of the Age, he stressed this connection, claiming a healthy state needs inner peace guaranteed only by the church, and idealizing the pre-Reformation German Christian Empire. Adam Muller's Elements of Political Theory from 1809 serves as a paradigm for late Romantic political theory. He saw the state as an organism dependent on religion, revered the past as divinely ordained, and condemned interventions against tradition as disrupting an organic process. This reinterpretation of the organism concept is characteristic. While adopting a highly traditional perspective, this conservatism wasn't just looking backwards. It aimed to revise the present, making it a kind of revolutionary conservatism. So, what are the lasting results of this philosophical romanticism? Fundamentally, it was an attempt to mold reality using philosophy and art. Its creative power was seen as unifying, capable of transcending the contradictions of the everyday world. This could take the form of cultural and political theories. Methodologically, it could be either revisionary or revolutionary. And crucially, it wasn't inherently tied to either modernism or traditionalism. It could proceed in either direction. This explains why you find romantics supporting both republics and monarchies. This romantic pre-modernism shouldn't be confused with mere reactionariness. Often, it's political strategies aimed at innovative cultural projects, even if framed within traditional structures. Philosophically, Romanticism was holistic, inherently critical of the Enlightenment's fragmentation. It sought to unify practical and theoretical philosophy. The central concept was imagination. To explain the complex interplay between the individual and the community, between nature and culture, it invoked a comprehensive cosmos. This required a delicate balancing act, being both individualistic and universalistic. It aimed to connect these opposites through a monistic holism that allowed for individual differences within the whole. The idea was that every single person expresses and signifies the entire universe or community. Epistemologically, Romanticism tried to integrate internalism and externalism. Its internalism came from the concepts of imagination and expression, while its externalism stemmed from its holistic view of nature. This version of internalism was valuable because it rejected simplistic ideas that the mind just passively represents the world. By emphasizing nature, it avoided the pitfalls of subjective idealism. Nature was central to contextualizing reason. Think of Schelling's naturalistic history of consciousness, or how political philosophy argued that abstract reason detached from society is empty. Reason only gains meaning within a community. This led to a humanism integrating reason and emotion, universality and individuality, cosmopolitanism and nationalism, though nationalism weakened in late Romanticism. It balanced individual self-determination with cultural self-determination, revising existing social realities. A key feature was criticizing both irrationality and abstract reason, relativism and abstract universalism. In late Romanticism, the focus on community narrowed, drawing parallels with later communitarian thought. Both reject the liberal separation of individual and cultural self-determination, arguing that true self-determination requires strong ties to a communal ethics. After 1800, the only major philosophical development stemming from Romanticism was Friedrich Schelling's late philosophy. He constructed a complex model of the relationship between nature and culture, giving mythology a central place in his system. For Schelling, an individual's role is determined by their position in history and their relation to an encompassing nature. Mythology's fundamental role lies in interpreting humanity's past, present, and future place within this larger natural context. He saw the first step towards a true mythology as reviving a symbolic view of nature. Schelling's critique of earlier idealism, including Hegel's, was that it didn't properly account for the specific nature of the external world. He argued that idealism doesn't have to exclude naturalistic realism. Drawing inspiration from Kant's third critique, which cautiously spoke of teleological structures in nature, Schelling pushed further. Nature isn't accidentally structured like us. It's an organism, functioning according to principles similar to ours. Nature is an organic whole of mind and matter unfolding through stages. This structural parallel between nature and mind allows overcoming the dualism of the given versus the produced. Subjectivity isn't just grounded in nature, it's also its expression, connected by a secret tie. Nature can be seen as visible mind and mind as invisible nature. In his treatise on human freedom, Schelling broke decisively from mainstream idealism. He sought a realistic concept of freedom that values both good and evil. He defined evil as the manifestation of Selbstheit, the selfhood of human existence, the process where individual freedom gains ontological status. This voluntaristic stance marked a departure. Discovering the groundlessness of freedom led to a radical turn. The self isn't the key to self-understanding. We get trapped in egocentric circles mistaken for our true self. We must step outside ourselves. Schelling boldly argued that while we can never fully control our conditions, freedom drives us to try constantly. Subjectivity finds itself only in what is not itself. The tragedy is that it must lose its individuality to truly find itself. The core problem of the conditioned versus the absolute remains central. The absolute can transform into the conditioned arbitrarily, but the conditioned cannot grasp the absolute. Schelling argued reason doesn't posit an opposite, it sets its own absolute. Reason must limit itself to function. Accepting an external limit would undermine its capacity for reflection. The limit of reason isn't a flaw, but lies in something seemingly external. His theory of self-limitation, part of his negative and positive philosophy, was a direct reply to Hegel, accusing him of conflating logical necessity with existential necessity. Negative philosophy deals with forms, but existence itself remains unexplained. In reflecting on reason's limits, subjectivity becomes obscure, unlike Hegel. Ultimately, Schelling arrived at an unsolvable mystery, human existence itself. Man is incomprehensible, driving the despairing question, why is there anything at all? Why not nothing? Schelling's journey took him from a mythology of reason and absolute freedom to acknowledging the mystery of being, anticipating existentialism. That concludes our exploration of politics and the new mythology.